time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. It's episode 36, the UK's most popular business podcast. I'm Rob Bence, and with me every single week is Rob Dix. Good morning, Rob. How are you?
Morning. Very good, thank you. So we've got a good one this week. We're talking about the insanity, in inverted commas, of Britain's property market and what it means for you as an investor. We've also got a resource of the week, all about cutting down the amount of time you spend on email, which is always a popular one. And I imagine we're probably going to mention the Property Hub at some point as well.
Absolutely. I feel like goes without saying, Rob. But before we start, we're going to give thanks to the people who make this possible, why we're here, the reviews. And plenty more in as usual, Rob, 5-star reviews. So thank you. We don't take it for granted. We love them, in fact. And the first one's from Mr. Tom Ollerton, someone we both have spoken with, Rob, and it says, top podcast. This podcast is brilliant, simple enough for a northerner to understand, and sophisticated enough for a southerner to sip sherry to. Good work on the secret episode, although I couldn't listen to it on the 2x speed as I normally do. Thank you very much, Tom. And Steve says, just perfect. Thanks, Rob and Rob. I'm not a complete newbie, having just started my second property to let. I really wish this was around 2 years ago, as it would have given me a lot more confidence that my ideas on things like leverage and revaluing are right. This is a really good podcast and is set in such a way for newer guys, but technical enough for the slightly more experienced. A genuine 5 stars from me, but would love to have an episode on tax. Well, Steve, as you now know, you've had that episode because we're a little bit behind on reviews because so many are in, but I hope you enjoyed that one and it proves we listen. And finally, Chris says, a wealth of knowledge. I bought my first buy-to-let at the beginning of August. Congratulations, Chris. And have listened to all your podcasts back to back during my daily commute to work. Usually spend 2 hours a day in the car. And since finding your podcast, my commute's been so enjoyable. I only wish there was more podcasts each week. It's been more interesting, if not a more important part of my day. The podcast is brilliant. So much great advice, really important information, and presented extremely well. I cannot say how much this information has helped me in the early days of property investment. Keep up the great work. Well, wow, Rob, fantastic reviews once again.
Wonderful reviews. Thank you so much. Love to hear those. Although I do feel a bit like a walking stereotype now because I was in a bar having sherry just last night. But in my defence, it was where Hemingway used to go in Madrid, and that's what he used to drink. So I feel like that's probably excusable. It's not just me being a pansy southerner.
No, but don't worry, Rob. I even out on the roughness north.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. In the same vein as that, I know we've both got a ton going on at the moment, but the most exciting thing for both of us is the Property Hub. We've announced it last week. We won't go into loads of detail again, but last time we checked there, we had a huge number of people who'd signed up to find out more about it and get notified when it launched. So thank you for everyone who signed up. For our launch offer, last time we checked, we had 10 places left, but as you might know, we record this a little bit in advance, so they could have all gone by now. We don't know. But the response that we've had to it and all the nice emails we've had have been just fantastic. So that's really vindicated our decision to do this, and it's made us even more determined to make this really, really exciting for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, hundreds of people have signed up to be notified of its launch, literally hundreds. So thank you. We're overwhelmed with that response. And to all the people who've gone for the Property Hub Plus, you know, we can't wait to interact with you there. And if that's of interest to you, as I say, this is recorded a little bit in advance, so it might have gone. But if you are interested, go to thepropertyhub.net and grab one of those early bird places. But either way, if you miss out, get yourself on the free list because we'll keep you in touch with everything that's going on.
Let's get moving on to what's actually going to be our combined news story and our topic of the week. I believe we've got a listener called Tom Hannicher to thank for this one. He pointed us towards a Buzzfeed article, which we'll link to in the show notes. It's written by Daniel Knowles, who's a writer for The Economist, and he wrote a piece about the insanity of Britain's housing market. He made a lot of different points in that, so we thought we would go through them one by one, talk about the points that he made, what we think about them, and end up with what is undoubtedly a strange housing market in our country, what it means for you as an investor.
Yeah, it's a really interesting article, and I've looked into some of Daniel's stuff, and he's done some interesting interviews on TV. In particular, there's a good one if you Google him. He was on Newsnight, and he was up against some lunatic who was defending gold, and that was about a month and a half ago, and since then, gold has only gone down, and something Daniel was saying that was going to happen. So, the guy comes with a lot of credibility, but some of his points are absolutely spot on, and some we found a little suspect, but we'll get to those. Well, his first point was, you may have noticed everyone's talking about property prices all of the time. Well, we can't disagree with that one, Rob. We do a podcast on it. So, Daniel, absolutely agree. Point one, we're a nation obsessed with property.
Yep, and we're only fueling that podcast. But his second point is, for all the property madness, home ownership is at its lowest level since the 80s. He says for pretty much the first time in recorded history, home ownership is falling. Not sure if that's quite true. If you look at 1980, the percentage was under 57, and today it's over 65% of people who own their home. I think his point was that it's falling, not that it's lower than it has been. But of course, we know that some of the reasons behind that, and we know that the Help to Buy scheme is coming in soon, and that's going to aim to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the number has dipped slightly, but that's because there's been a lot of reluctant renters, and the Help to Buy scheme that's just started is certainly going to push that number back up again in the short term. So, although it sort of adds weight to his argument that it's insane, actually, I think Daniel would agree, if he could comment on this show, that it probably will start nudging back upwards again. Okay, so number 3, and it's the young that are losing out the most. In the short term, yes, the young, compared to 3-4 years ago when the recession kicked in, the percentage of younger buyers is less. You can't, get around from that. However, as we've said, in the short term, the Help to Buy scheme will lift that. So that number will readjust itself back to normal levels. Will that continue in the future? Because Help to Buy increases prices, then even though it's a lower percentage, the deposit amount people have to put in is still higher. So we'll wait and see. It's an interesting point, on such a short data span, covering 3 or 4 years. I think you can't really say the younger losing out yet. We'll see in maybe 5-6 years' time, after the Help to Buy is kicked in and house prices have risen, where the stats lie then.
Yeah, he does also make the point, though, that the extent to which young people are affected might be greater than the numbers look like, because so many people in their mid-20s, early 30s are getting help from their parents to buy a house, which I think is probably a fair point as well. Okay, so he says the reason for this is that the price of property is just too damn high. He says that the long-run trend of property is up and up and up. And, as investors, we're kind of happy about that to an extent. So yes, the property price has gone up, but at the present time, it is way below its peak when you take inflation into account. So property prices might be high, but they're not as high as they have been. There's also the point of how high is too high. If you're going to say that the price is too high, you need to kind of put some numbers around that. There are a couple of things that we can look at to determine exactly how high house prices are relative to incomes, which is what really matters. In 1983, so about 30 years ago, the average house was 3.5 times earnings, and they're now 4.5 times earnings. The average over the whole 30 years is about 4 times earnings, so they are relatively expensive now compared to what they have been in the past. But pre-crash, into about 2006 and 7, they have been as high as 6 times earnings. So again, not as high as they have been. Also, before even the Help to Buy scheme has started, mortgages are more affordable than they have been for a very long time. The average mortgage at the moment would take up 27.5% of a household budget. Whereas in the 80s, because of interest rates, the average mortgage took up 36% of a household budget. It's not just thinking about the price that you pay for the property as a whole. It's about how much the payments on it are going to cost you as a homeowner. And that percentage has been a lot higher than it is now.
Yeah, I completely agree, Rob. And I think that's why the house price earnings ratio is one that I don't pay too much attention for that exact point. Because in the 80s, people go, it was less. But interest rates were sky high. So the amount of proportion of your wage that it took up, your income that it took up, was a lot higher. Although that number may have looked less in the 80s, people use that as a base point, as an argument to say, look, that proves property's overpriced. But what you've brought there, the data you've brought to the podcast, shows that it's just absolute nonsense. It's about how much a percentage of your income it takes up. Very interesting point. Next, if everything you bought in the 70s had increased at the same rate as houses, then a 4-pint carton of milk would cost £10.45, a chicken would cost £51.18, To be fair, in Waitrose, their organic ones probably do. A bunch of bananas would cost £8.47, box of eggs £5, bread £4, lamb £53, and the list goes on. Now, I agree. There's nothing to disagree with that. Property is an inflation-beating asset. That's why I love it. So yeah, absolutely agree. Is it right? Well, we'll come to that later on.
So why is it an inflation-beating asset? What drives up the price? Well, Daniel says that it's because we're not building enough new houses, and it's hard to argue with that. So his data point was that construction started on just 107,000 new homes in England last year, which is the lowest since the 1920s if you exclude World War II. Hard to agree with that, not building enough houses. However, there is some data to suggest that it might be improving. So the construction industry has something called the PMI report, and that suggests that 12,000 more new homes were started in the third quarter of this year, 2013, than they were in the same quarter in 2012. So that's being interpreted as showing that the activity is higher than it has been at any time since 2008. That is extrapolating from one quarter's data and making the assumption it's going to continue, which we don't know. But it does seem that because of optimism and some help from the government and various things, more new homes are being started now than there have been.
That's true, Rob. And more new homes have been built, but we're still way, way below where we need to be. And the Barker report said that we need to be near on 250,000 homes built every year. And we've not hit that target once, not even during the boom up to 2007. With that said, yes, we are building more, but still nowhere near enough to meet the current demand. And that's just to keep level. We're way off, and we've been way off for years ever since that target was set. Good news that we're building more, but a long, long way to go. And that's obviously comes back to supply and demand, which we're going to talk about in a bit. 7, again, added to that supply and demand factor, the population is growing faster than any time since the 60s. Incredible stats, really. You know, the population is growing. So it's for a combination of reasons. People are living longer, more people are moving to this country. Therefore, the population grows. That's the way it is. With more people in this country and the supply not being increased of properties and homes, then obviously it's going to have an upward pressure on property prices. So yeah, absolutely agree. And it's a good point.
So if we've got all this increased demand, why isn't there more supply? Why can't we just build more? Well, the article says that it's all because of planning laws. So it all dates back to 1947, which is when the Town and Country Planning Act came in, and that's when it was first illegal to build anything without planning permission. The idea at the time was that the government would provide most of the new housing, and the development of new private homes would be very strongly restricted. And that's also when they introduced green belts around big cities like London, Oxford and Birmingham, beyond which you couldn't build anything, to restrict the urban sprawl that they saw as a threat at the time. As we know, it hasn't quite shaken out like that, in that government has not built very much new housing at all. That's one of the reasons that he's pinpointed about why the amount of new houses being built are way lower than they should be. So I'm not an expert in planning law at all, but you could argue that it needs to be liberalised to make it easier to build new homes.
Yeah, it's where you draw the line now, and everyone talks about NIMBYs, not in my backyard. You know, people all agree we should build more, but nobody wants it near them. So next, 9, controversial one, and I'll try and stay as neutral on this one as possible so I don't lose half our listeners. But this woman should get the blame, and he's a picture of Margaret Thatcher. And he says, Margaret Thatcher's government stopped councils from building new homes, and she made it easier for people to get mortgages. But she didn't make it easier for private developers to build new houses on greenfields. So all of the new borrowed money just pushed prices up and up. Margaret Thatcher's a controversial figure. She's a bit of Marmite. What I would say is she created the opportunity for many people to buy their own home. Absolutely agree. So made a lot of these people wealthy. You know, a lot of people who never had the chance to get on the property ladder, she gave that chance too. So in the short to medium term, she actually made the country, in terms of, general wealth, a lot better off. You can say that she didn't contribute to increasing the supply, but no government has. You can say she can take a proportion of the blame, but every government should, really. You can't put it all down to her. But interesting point. It's easy to throw Thatcher into any argument when you're talking about these type of things. Let's move on. But I don't think you can blame her for all the housing woes on a supply side.
His main argument seems to be against Greenbelt and planning restrictions. He's just thrown Thatcher in there as a little bit of a bonus, I suppose. But we're mainly talking about the difficulty of building on Greenbelt areas. And one of his points I could not support at all. He has got a picture of a field. It says, this is just outside Watford, that well-known area of outstanding natural beauty. Well, I feel duty-bound to support Watford and say that what it lacks in beauty, it makes up for in many other things, not the football team, sadly. But he says that you should be able to build on these fields just outside Watford because, well, why not? Seems to be the argument. And that links into his next point, Rob, about urban sprawl.
Yeah, point 10. Rob was fine when I showed him this article until we got to point 10 and he had to go and take a breather for 5 minutes. Oh, Daniel, you don't know what you did to him. Number 11, he says, we need to protect the countryside from urban sprawl, right? Wrong. He says, just 10% of England is classified as urban, and that 10th isn't all concrete. It includes parks, golf courses, gardens, canals, etc. So just 2.27% of England is actually built on. Now, I think it's been way oversimplified. Yes, what he's saying is true, but let's put it into context. The UK is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Out of major countries, the UK is by far one of the most densely populated. In Europe, it's fourth, okay? And it's only a lot smaller countries like Malta and the Netherlands and Belgium that lie ahead of it. You know, when you compare it to Italy, Spain, Germany, the UK is far more densely populated. It's one of those stats that are really a bit misleading. Yes, the stat technically is true, but when you put it into context, then, you know, where do you draw the line? What can you do? You can't suddenly build in the Brecon Beacons or the Peak District, you know, suddenly a new city. So what's the limit? I think it's slightly oversimplified the point.
Yeah, exactly. But bigger cities or more densely populated cities come with problems. Like if you take a city and you expand it by 100,000 people, then you're going to need jobs and infrastructure for those people. Restricting the size of cities isn't just about protecting the countryside. There are other parts to it as well. And when he says that, well, you know, not all of it's built on anyway because there's parks and golf courses and gardens. So, well, I kind of like parks and gardens and stuff like that. I don't know if I'd want to live in a city that was just 100% urban jungle and nothing to it at all. And this seems to be linking into his next point, number 12, which seems to be about London's skyline. He says there are laws restricting us from building taller buildings in central London. And he points out that it's illegal to build anything that blocks views of St. Paul's Cathedral from several key points. He's sort of making out that this is some kind of anachronistic thing that, like, to protect the view of St. Paul's, we can't have all the new buildings we need. But that just seems to be plain not true. Like, irrespective of that, it's like, how much bigger do we want London to be? That London is overpopulated as it is, and it's not going to solve the problem if you sort of make some taller buildings so you can pack some more people into them. And Rob, you made a really good point as well, which is that because of flight paths, you can't have buildings in the way either. Otherwise, you're going to have everything that's coming into Heathrow is going to have to, like, dodge around buildings every 5 minutes.
Exactly. That's why they've got that sort of 1,000-foot limit that they can't really go much above. You know, Canary Wharf and all around there. If you've ever flown into Heathrow, you often fly over the Thames into the airport. It's a lovely view as you come in, but I wanted to have a lovely view and not the pilot to be swerving around buildings as he does come in. And to say, you know, St. Paul's, you know, it's not exactly, you know, a garbage site. You know, I wouldn't want the view blocked. You know, there's not many buildings like that in the world. Why would you want to block it? You know, imagine them doing that in Rome. You know, suddenly like building high rises all around the Colosseum. And for me, it's a bit of a silly one. Okay. Next, why can't we build up? Well, we can build out. So where can we build? He looks at Barking and he puts a picture of there. It's not a particularly flattering photo of Barking. But he says, this is where one of the places we're looking to build, and it takes over an hour to get into central London at the moment. Because funding hasn't been agreed for proper rail links, but the house is still cost over 300,000. Looking at it, it says it's going to cost a lot of money to make it look nice. Well, I think he's barking mad on this one, because I looked at the train links, and you can get into Tottenham Court Road in 35 minutes from Barking. So I don't know what he classes as central London, but, you know, you can get into other areas I would class central as less than that. I think he's got his estimations on transport out by a double, or he's probably tried to find the worst case scenario. But even so, look at Stratford next door. Look at how that's turned round. You know, it's good that these areas are regenerated. You know, it's good that money's spent on them. Why should all the money just stay in West London? Why can't East London be regenerated and money spent and made that to look like a nice place to live and bring more families there? I don't really understand the point in this one. I think that's a good thing. Rather than trapping all the money in already wealthy areas of places like London, you know, he's already said that London needs to be built up. Well, why can't you build out a bit and just improve the transport links slightly? The transport links aren't terrible. 35 minutes for most people is a reasonable commute. I don't know, I think it's a slightly weak argument, that one.
Yeah, well, let's move on to a quick one, which is the result of that. And he says that because you can't build up for reasons we've talked about, and it's hard to build out because of green belts, that means that land is really expensive. It's hard to argue with that one, but the value of your property is largely in the land that it sits on and not in the actual bricks and wood and everything else that goes on top of it. Land is expensive, and he makes the point that land with planning is vastly more expensive than land without planning permission. And he says that the planning laws as they are now add about £45,000 to the cost of a house. So I don't know where that figure comes from, if it's true, but you can't really argue that, land is expensive.
Yeah, no doubts on that one. That's where the value is, in the land, not the property. Most people get that wrong. They think it's the home, that's what's the value, but it's actually the land it sits on normally. Number 15 was, which may explain why British new homes, so new builds, are the tiniest in the world. And he says the average home in the UK is roughly half the size of a new build in the 1930s. The stats are true, but let's put them into context again. In the 1930s, there used to be several people to a home, large families, you'd often get several to a bedroom. That's how we used to live back then. Now, it's less than 2 to a home. It's 1.8, 1.9 is the average. So yes, the homes are smaller, but as a nation, we like to have our own place. So obviously there has to be some sort of compromise. So yes, true. But again, you have to look deeper behind the points that are made. And that's hopefully what this podcast is about.
Yep, exactly. And well, the next thing is he says, what's the solution? Well, we can change the planning laws. And I think this is where we diverge from the article a bit, because the article is being used as an argument for changing planning law. And that's fine, but that's not going to happen. And so we're more concerned with looking at the way things are, why things are the way they are, and then making decisions about what to do based on that, rather than kind of coming up with a solution which sounds great, but in practice, it's just not realistic. Obviously, you need to have people who are sort of pushing for idealistic solutions and doing what they think is right. But we're more in the camp of, all right, let's just kind of see what's realistically going to happen in the coming year so we can plan for it. Planning laws are not going to change dramatically. You're not going to be able to do what he suggests and expand London by a mile into the green belt all the way around it to add 1 million new homes. It's not going to happen.
No, I live in Hertfordshire, Rob. That's not good for me.
Yeah. So luckily, I think that's off the table. But you know what? I don't think that that's a great solution anyway. Like, there are places other than London, much as the media might not want to acknowledge it. There is life outside London, and with technology the way it is, like, jobs and economic prosperity shouldn't be centralized in one place. Theoretically, we should be less reliant on our location than ever before. So there's no reason why everyone has to be packed into London. And the only answer to getting more people in is to pack more people into London and make London bigger. Let's look at outside London at other areas of the UK. And let's look at bringing empty homes back into use. So according to one piece of research, there are 710,000 empty homes in the UK at the moment. And within that, there are big regional variations. So within London, apparently 2.12% of homes are empty. And in the northeast, it's almost double that. So you're looking at over 4% of properties sitting empty. And in the northwest, it's a similar story. It's nearly as bad. Actually, the numbers are going to be even higher than that, because this is taken from council tax data, and that doesn't include homes that have been classified as uninhabitable. So if you look at areas where there are a lot of houses that have fallen into complete disrepair, and there are some places where you get entire neighbourhoods that are just boarded up and no one could live there, they're not going to be counted in those figures. So there was research in Bradford that found that there were 5,000 uninhabitable homes in Bradford alone. So there are going to be thousands more across the country. How about making 1 million new homes by bringing existing homes back into use and spreading some of that wealth around a little bit, rather than just packing 1 million more people into London? There's also an argument for new towns, maybe, and starting up sort of new sort of urban centres. Basically what I'm saying is that making existing cities bigger isn't the only answer, but every answer that I've just talked about and every answer that you could possibly come up with is going to involve money. And that's sort of the sticking point at the moment.
It is, Rob. Planning laws, they're not going to change. People say, yes, we want more homes, but they don't want to buy them. In an ideal world, yes, we'd all suddenly become unemotional and just build more homes, but it's not going to happen. So I think the points you make are absolutely fantastic. Really, this comes down to is looking at what does this mean? So we understand that the situation isn't going to change dramatically. We can improve things, as Rob said, by looking at empty homes, but still, the situation, the supply and demand factors are going to change. Go back to the article. There's more people in the country. We're not building enough homes. The planning laws are strict. All this puts pressure upwards on property prices over the long term. Yes, there may be short-term fluctuations when there's reckless lending or government intervention, but generally, the upward movement of property prices will continue. Let's have a look at, what this means for investors. Well, high housing prices are a supply and demand issue. That's the first thing. And demand seems unlikely to go down anytime soon. So that's what I've just said. Supply does seem to be increasing, but it's still way lower than it needs to be. Bring supply and demand into balance. Now, easier said than done, but it needs to happen.
But then the big measures that you seem to be able to take to increase supply seem either unrealistic, like getting rid of the green belt, or very expensive, like building entirely new towns from scratch, bringing existing homes back into use, and so on. And in any case, even if you do that, the UK is a small and relatively rich country. And as long as it stays that way, demand is always going to be high. The UK is a small island. It's not going to get any bigger. And so that demand is always going to be there as long as economically people are going to want to live here and there's the wealth and the jobs and everything else that make it a desirable place to live. I think what this boils down to is that whatever happens with things that you're going to hear about in the media, like Help to Buy and the number of new housing starts and everything else, property seems like a good long-term investment because of these kind of big overriding factors. Worst case, property is an inflation-proof asset. It's proven to be that way for decades and decades, and it puts money in your pocket every month. So that's not too bad. The point I'm making is not to get spooked by when you hear about demand falling or whatever else and whatever prices are going to do, because over the long term, which is what we're concerned by, property seems like it's going to be a pretty desirable asset for a long time to come.
Agree or disagree with the situation, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, property prices going up. This is the way it is. Daniel's article, some of the fundamental points are correct, but he hasn't come up with the solutions either. And that's the problem. The solutions aren't easy to find. So we live in this country where property prices for the foreseeable future over the long term will be pushed upwards. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing doesn't really matter. What's more important is the choice you make. Do you want to be an investor and invest in that market and enjoy the returns that property will bring, and that could give you and your family financial security? Or do you want to take a stand and go, no, I'm against this and watch other people become wealthy? Whether that is nice or not nice, it's a situation and we have to make choices, as individuals. So Daniel's points are fundamentally correct. There are too many people and not enough homes built. That's what it really, if we're going to put that article in a sentence, that's what it is. Too many people, not enough being built. And that creates house price rises. It's up to you to decide what you want to do about them. So as an investor, this is a really, really interesting article. Thank you, Daniel, for making this show easy to put together because they are all your points. I hope you don't mind with what we've said.
Yeah, and thank you, Tom, for drawing us towards that article in the first place. We're going to link to it in the show notes, of course. Also, some of the articles we've taken some of our figures from about the points that we added to it. We'll link to those as well, so you know that we're not just plucking numbers out the air. But let us know what you think. Maybe it's a controversial one. I'm sure there'll be bits in there that you agree with and bits that you don't. So get over to the show notes for this episode on thepropertypodcast.com, leave a comment and let us know what you think.
Super. Okay, so our resource of the week, always popular. And this week, I think it's a really good one. I've been using it, and it's called the email game. We'll link to it in the show notes, of course, so you can find it, but it's the email game. And it's essentially a game for your emails. Go figure. So what you do is you link your account, and you can do that with many of the platforms. Gmail is what I use and Rob uses. You give them access and it brings your emails into their platform, which is a game format, and you're given a time to read the email. And then if you choose to reply, you get a time to reply, and you're put under pressure, if you like, to beat the clock. Though it sounds really simple, the gamification side of the process really makes you speed up your email replies. I drown in emails. They are far from my favorite thing. I love receiving them and I love, speaking with investors, but the process of getting through so many really eats up large proportions of my day. So the email game I've been using last week has really helped me to cut down, just do quick blasts of emails. I think it gives you 30 minutes to get through them all. Also, it links to Boomerang, Rob, a resource of the week we've linked to before. And Boomerang basically is a service that allows you to say, okay, I want to reply to this email on Tuesday next week at this time, or I want to have a look at this email tomorrow, send it away and send it back then. Because it may be something that needs actioning, but you don't want it sitting in your inbox. It's really interesting. But the little cheat, Rob, is that Boomerang limits you when you use it through Gmail. But when you use it through the email game, you get an unlimited supply. So a little hack there as well.
That's sneaky. That's worthy of me. Very impressed with that one. I've not personally used the email game, but I've heard of it, and it's good to hear that it's working for you. It basically plays into the old maxim that work expands to fill the time allowed for it, or whatever it is. Basically, if you're put under pressure, you can get things done a lot quicker than you think. And I'd probably benefit from it because I know that I tend to get bogged down in email and sort of writing things that are far too long or go into too much detail or whatever. And so a bit of pressure from the clock probably helps you get your core points over without having it take over your entire day. We've linked to that in the show notes. Go check it out.
Okay, so that's us for another week. Thank you again for listening. We really appreciate it. Thank you for all the reviews. Please keep them coming. We really, really do love receiving them and reading them all. And remember to jump on thepropertyhub.net. If there's any plus places and you want one, go and have a quick look to see if there's any left. Grab the last few remaining if there are. And if you haven't yet, get on that list to find out what's happening. Hundreds already have. We'll keep you informed. The Property Podcast list, we don't want to send you mixed stuff. We'll just continue to send stuff out the podcast. But if you want to hear about the hub, what's happening, how we're building that out, all the exciting updates from Rob and myself, then go to that list.
Yep, definitely do that. And then we'll see you back here next week for an episode that we're calling Bubble or Bust, cutting through the media spin. So that should be a really good one. We'll see you then.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.